She had my car towed in broad daylight, smiling like she'd finally won. An hour later, a legally permitted 30-ton tank rolled in, and her entire street became completely unusable. If you enjoy real HOA karma, where power trips end quietly but permanently, subscribe now, because stories like this only happen when someone knows the rules better than the bully. The tow truck arrived before sunrise, quiet enough that most of the street slept through it. I didn't. I heard the metallic scrape of chains, the short burst of hydraulics, and then the unmistakable sound of my car being dragged backward out of its spot. By the time I reached the window, the truck was already pulling away, my vehicle disappearing around the corner like it had never been there. I knew exactly who was responsible. The HOA president had made her intentions clear the day before. She'd stood at the edge of the sidewalk, clipboard tucked under her arm, listing violations that didn't exist. Parking rules she couldn't cite. Boundaries she couldn't prove. Warnings delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged. I hadn't argued. I'd simply asked for written proof. That was when her smile tightened. She told me the HOA would handle it. No explanation. No citation. Just certainty. People like her rely on that certainty without verification. Most residents don't push back. They move their cars. They pay the fines. They accept inconvenience to avoid conflict. I didn't. The spot my car had been parked in wasn't HOA property. It wasn't common space. It wasn't restricted. It was part of a right-of-way governed by municipal ordinance, not neighborhood rules. I knew that because I checked months earlier, long before she ever noticed my vehicle. The tow itself wasn't just wrong. It was illegal. When I stepped outside later that morning, she was already waiting, standing near the curb, arms crossed, satisfaction written plainly across her face. She told me this was what happened when residents ignored community standards. She said the HOA had authority. She said the matter was closed. I asked where my car was. She gave me the number of the tow company like it was a final verdict. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I thanked her and walked back inside. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that I wasn't scrambling to get my car back. I was checking permits, documentation, timelines. Because when someone abuses authority, the most effective response isn't confrontation. It's correction. The tow company confirmed everything within minutes. They'd been instructed by the HOA. No police involvement. No municipal authorization. Just a signed request from someone who assumed her title was enough. It wasn't. By mid-morning, I had what I needed. Not anger. Not leverage. Permission. The vehicle I owned, registered, insured, and fully legal, wasn't a car. It was a decommissioned armored tank transporter I'd acquired years earlier for private industrial use. 30 tons of steel. Street legal under a specific permit. Allowed to be parked temporarily on public roadways under controlled conditions. The permit was still valid. I placed the call calmly, the same way she had when she ordered the tow. No urgency. No explanation beyond logistics. Within the hour, the transporter was en route. When it arrived, the street changed instantly. The sound came first, a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through the pavement. Windows shook. Conversation stopped. Residents stepped outside, confused, watching something massive roll slowly into view. The transporter didn't block a driveway. It didn't cross private property. It didn't violate a single ordinance. It stopped exactly where it was allowed to stop. Right in the middle of her street. Traffic froze. No one could pass. Emergency lanes remained technically open, but normal access was gone. Delivery trucks turned around. Residents stood on sidewalks, phones out, realizing something unusual was happening. She came out of her house moments later. The smile was gone. She demanded to know what was happening, who authorized it, how long it would be there. I answered each question calmly, the same way I'd answered hers the day before. It was permitted. It was temporary. And it was compliant. The look on her face wasn't anger yet. It was panic. Because for the first time, she was on the wrong side of the rules. And everyone could see it. The street didn't erupt the way you might expect. There was no shouting, no immediate chaos. What replaced normalcy was something far more uncomfortable: stillness. Cars sat idling at the entrance, drivers staring at the steel mass that had turned their familiar route into a dead end. The tank transporter didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough. She paced along the sidewalk, phone pressed to her ear, voice sharp and urgent. I could hear fragments carried by the air, complaints, demands, explanations that sounded convincing only if no one checked them. She was trying to summon authority the same way she always had, assuming it would arrive simply because she asked. It didn't. The first call went nowhere. Then the second. Then a third. Each time, her tone shifted slightly, confidence thinning into irritation. She kept glancing at the transporter, then back at her phone, as if willing it to disappear through sheer insistence. Neighbors gathered in small groups. No one approached me directly, but eyes kept drifting in my direction. People were connecting dots. They remembered the tow truck. They remembered her warnings. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't random. She finally walked over, stopping a few steps away. She demanded I move it immediately. She said it was unsafe. She said it violated HOA rules. She said she'd have it removed just like my car. I told her she was welcome to try. That stopped her cold. I explained again calmly that the transporter was legally permitted, that it wasn't on HOA property, and that it was parked within municipal guidelines. I even offered to show her the paperwork. She didn't look. She didn't want proof. She wanted compliance. When she threatened to call the police, I nodded, encouraged it, the same way she had encouraged enforcement the day before. She made the call. This time, people watched openly. When the officers arrived, the scene looked very different from the previous morning. Instead of a single car being towed quietly away, there was a 30-ton machine sitting squarely in the road, drawing attention from blocks away. The officers approached cautiously, not because of danger, but because of scale. They asked who owned it. I stepped forward. They asked why it was there. I answered honestly. Temporary parking under a valid permit. Documentation available. No obstruction of emergency access. No violation of posted restrictions. They reviewed the permit carefully. Radios crackled. Addresses were confirmed. One officer walked the length of the transporter, checking clearances and signage. Everything was in order. She tried to interrupt, insisting that HOA rules prohibited oversized vehicles. The officer stopped her politely and explained that HOA rules don't override municipal permits on public roads. He reminded her that this had already been discussed the day before. That reminder landed hard. The officers told me I was within my rights and asked how long the vehicle would remain. I gave them a time frame well within the permit's limits. They nodded, satisfied. Then they turned to her. They explained that calling for enforcement without jurisdiction was inappropriate. Again, they advised her to resolve disputes through proper channels and not misuse emergency services. Again, she said nothing this time. As the officers left, the crowd slowly dispersed. Cars turned around. People went back inside, but not before exchanging looks that said everything. The balance of power on that street had shifted, visibly and permanently. The transporter stayed right where it was. And every minute it remained, it reminded everyone of a simple truth she had ignored. Rules cut both ways, and authority without proof collapses the moment someone decides to follow them properly. The transporter stayed put through the afternoon, unmoving and unavoidable. It didn't blare alarms or flashlights. It simply existed. 30 tons of steel resting, exactly where the permit allowed it to rest. That quiet compliance was what made it impossible to argue with. There was nothing to tow, nothing to cite, nothing to threaten without exposing ignorance. The street adapted awkwardly. Residents rerouted their drives. Delivery vans backed out carefully. A school pickup paused, then chose another way in. Every inconvenience traced back to the same point, and everyone knew it. The earlier tow that had happened before dawn was no longer a private humiliation. This was public, slow, and instructive. She tried a different tactic. Instead of demands, she started explaining. She told neighbors the vehicle was temporary. She said it would be gone soon. She suggested it was a misunderstanding. Each sentence tried to soften what had already hardened into perception. People listened politely, but no one intervened on her behalf. Explanations don't erase patterns. By mid-afternoon, the HOA board began calling. Not emails, calls. They asked what was happening. They asked who authorized the vehicle. They asked whether there was a way to resolve this quietly. The word quietly carried a lot of weight. It meant they understood how visible this had become. I told them the truth. My car had been towed without legal authority. I'd responded by exercising my own legal rights. Everything was permitted. Everything was documented. There was nothing to negotiate until my vehicle was returned and the illegal tow acknowledged. The line went silent for a moment. Then they asked if I would consider moving the transporter once the situation was corrected. Consider was a big shift from demand. I said I would after compliance was restored. Not before. The tow company called shortly after. Their tone was careful now. They asked for clarification. They asked whether there had been a mistake. They asked how quickly the situation could be smoothed over. Companies that act on shaky instructions suddenly become cooperative when liability enters the room. I told them I expected my car returned to its original location, undamaged, and the towing fee voided. I also asked for written confirmation of who authorized the tow. That last part mattered most. They agreed. An hour later, my car was back, placed carefully, exactly where it had been taken from. No confrontation. No apologies spoken out loud. Just quiet correction. I waited. The transporter remained. Neighbors noticed. The message was clear. Returning the car fixed one problem. It didn't erase the abuse of authority that caused it. That would take acknowledgement, not convenience. As evening approached, the HOA board sent a formal message to residents. It stated that a towing action earlier that day had been conducted without proper authorization and that parking enforcement would be suspended pending review. The wording was cautious, but the meaning was unmistakable. She stayed inside. Lights were on, but curtains didn't move. The street felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. People stood at a distance, watching a process unfold they'd never seen before. Rules being applied evenly. I finally received the written confirmation from the tow company. The authorization came from her. Her name, her signature, her assumption of power in ink. That was enough. I called the transporter operator and gave the go-ahead. The engine rumbled to life, slow and deep. The sound traveled down the street, drawing people back to their windows. The vehicle rolled forward carefully, clearing the road inch by inch, until the street opened again. Normal traffic resumed within minutes. But normal didn't feel the same, because everyone had seen how quickly assumed authority fell apart when someone followed the rules more carefully than the bully ever had. She had my car towed, thinking inconvenience would force submission. Instead, she taught the entire street a lesson about power, permits, and what happens when confidence outruns legitimacy. And that lesson wasn't going away. The next morning, the street looked ordinary again. Cars lined the curbs. People went to work. Kids waited for buses. But beneath that routine, something had shifted permanently. The spectacle was gone, yet its effect lingered in the way people spoke more carefully and watched authority more closely. The HOA board didn't wait long to respond. By mid-morning, an official notice went out to residents. Not a reminder, not a warning, a statement. It explained that the towing incident had been unauthorized, that enforcement procedures were under review, and that all towing actions were suspended until further notice. The language was deliberately neutral, but everyone understood what it meant. Someone had crossed a line, and the board was trying to contain the fallout. Phones buzzed across the neighborhood. Group chats lit up. People compared what they'd seen with what they'd been told for years. The contrast was unsettling. For a long time, rules had been enforced because no one questioned whether they could be. Now, people were asking where those rules actually came from. She didn't appear that day. Her driveway stayed empty. Curtains drawn. No clipboard. No patrol of the street. The absence itself felt like an admission. When someone who once thrived on visibility disappears, it's rarely by choice. I received a call from a board member that afternoon. The tone was different from anything I'd heard before. Measured. Careful. They wanted to understand the sequence of events. Not to debate them. Not to justify them. To document them. Documentation is what happens when organizations realize confidence isn't enough anymore. I walked them through it calmly. The warning. The tow. The lack of authority. The permit. The transporter. The police confirmation. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't editorialize. Facts don't need emphasis when they're already uncomfortable. There was a long pause after I finished. The board member thanked me and said the association's legal counsel would be reviewing everything. Legal counsel doesn't get involved for misunderstandings. They get involved for exposure. That told me everything I needed to know. Later that evening, neighbors stopped me while walking their dogs or taking out trash. Not confrontational. Curious. They asked if what they'd heard was true, that the tow had been illegal, that the transporter had been permitted, that the HOA didn't actually have the authority it claimed. I answered simply, yes, yes, and no. No one argued. People don't argue with proof once they've seen it in action. The tow company sent a formal apology email that night, carefully worded and clearly written by someone who understood liability. They confirmed the fee had been voided, the incident logged. Internally, and future HOA requests would require verification. Businesses learn quickly when their assumptions cost them money. The streets settled into an uneasy calm over the next few days. No enforcement notices. No sudden rule reminders. No towing threats. The HOA was quiet, and that quiet wasn't confidence. It was recalibration. She finally reappeared late in the week. Not in charge. Not confronting anyone. Just moving from her car to her house. Head down, pace quick. No eye contact. No commentary. The authority she once carried had evaporated, leaving behind only caution. I realized then that the real impact hadn't been the tank or the tow reversal. It had been visibility. Everyone had seen what happened when rules were applied correctly instead of selectively. That memory would outlast any notice or meeting. Power thrives in the dark. Accountability thrives in daylight. She had towed my car thinking inconvenience would teach me a lesson. Instead, she taught the entire neighborhood one. And neighborhoods don't forget lessons like that easily. By the following week, the HOA's silence had become intentional. Not avoidance, containment. When an organization realizes it has overreached, the first instinct isn't to explain. It's to stop moving until the ground beneath it feels solid again. That pause spoke volumes. No new notices appeared on doors. No emails about parking compliance. No friendly reminders disguised as warnings. The enforcement machine that had once operated on confidence alone had shut itself down completely. And people noticed. Residents started talking openly now. Not whispering, not checking who might be listening. Just comparing experiences. Stories surfaced about questionable fines, arbitrary warnings, and rules that seemed to change depending on who was enforcing them. None of it was explosive. It didn't need to be. The pattern was enough. She kept her distance. When she did step outside, it was with a different posture. Shoulders lowered. No clipboard. No scanning the street like a patrol zone. She moved quickly, as if hoping to pass unnoticed. Authority that once demanded attention now avoided it. The HOA board sent out another update, longer than the last. It stated that enforcement procedures were being restructured, and that all future towing actions would require written approval from legal counsel. That single sentence confirmed everything. What had once been casual power had become a liability. I received a separate call from the HOA's attorney later that afternoon. He didn't accuse. He didn't threaten. He asked questions. Precise ones. About permits. About the tow authorization. About communication records. Lawyers don't ask questions unless they already know the answers, or are preparing for consequences. I provided everything: dates, times, emails, the written authorization from the tow company with her signature attached. No commentary, no tone, just facts. There was a pause on the line after I finished. He thanked me for my cooperation and said the board would be addressing the matter internally. Internally is what organizations say when they know a problem can't be solved by pretending it didn't happen. The tow company updated its policy shortly after. HOA requests now required proof of jurisdiction and written confirmation from property owners. That change didn't come from goodwill. It came from exposure. Businesses don't repeat mistakes that cost them credibility. The street felt different now. Not triumphant, alert. People parked without fear. Guests visited without warnings. The invisible pressure that had once governed behavior was gone, replaced by something healthier: awareness. One evening, a neighbor approached me quietly. He said he'd lived there for years and always assumed the HOA's word was final. He admitted he'd paid fines he never questioned, just to avoid trouble. Seeing the tank roll in, and then seeing the police confirm it was legal, had changed how he thought about authority. He wasn't angry. He was relieved. Relief is what comes when people realize they aren't powerless. The HOA, Karen, didn't confront me again. She didn't need to. Her actions had already done the talking for her. The system she'd relied on had stepped back, leaving her exposed in a role she was never authorized to play. By the end of the week, the HOA announced a full review of its enforcement policies, including a temporary suspension of all non-emergency actions. That announcement wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. And that made it powerful. Because procedures last longer than personalities. She had my car towed thinking inconvenience would force obedience. What she actually triggered was scrutiny. And scrutiny doesn't just stop one person. It reshapes the entire structure around them. Scrutiny has a long memory. Once it enters a system, it doesn't leave quietly. It lingers, asking questions long after the original incident fades. By the time the HOA finished its internal review, the neighborhood had already changed in ways no policy memo could reverse. People were reading documents now. Deeds came out of drawers. City ordinances were bookmarked. Conversations shifted from "they said" to "where does it say?" That shift alone stripped away most of the leverage the HOA had relied on for years. The board announced revised enforcement guidelines at the next meeting. Towing authority was removed from volunteers entirely. Any future action would require documented jurisdiction, legal review, and owner verification. The language was dense and unexciting, which was exactly the point. Drama had been replaced by procedure. She didn't attend that meeting. Her absence wasn't coincidence. The spotlight she once sought had become dangerous. Visibility now meant accountability, and accountability offered her nothing. The police department's follow-up confirmed what many suspected. The initial tow request had been flagged internally as unauthorized, and the subsequent call about the transporter had validated the need for verification protocols. Dispatchers were instructed to confirm jurisdiction before responding to HOA-related complaints. Officers were briefed to treat similar calls as civil matters unless clear violations existed. That one adjustment prevented dozens of future abuses. The tow company, stung by the incident, reached out again with written confirmation that HOA requests would require owner authorization going forward. Their tone was careful, almost apologetic, but professionalism replaced defensiveness quickly. Liability teaches faster than lectures ever could. The street settled into a new rhythm. Not celebratory, not tense, just normal. Cars parked where they were allowed. Guests came and went without scrutiny. No one hovered with a clipboard anymore, and the absence felt liberating. I noticed how quickly people recalibrated once fear disappeared. They didn't become reckless. They became reasonable. Rules that made sense were followed. Rules that didn't quietly vanished. Community began functioning the way it should have all along. She reappeared occasionally, but never in the role she once tried to own. No confrontations. No instructions. Just a resident moving through her day carefully, aware that eyes were open now. Borrowed authority doesn't return once the lender withdraws it. The board sent one final update before closing the review. It acknowledged procedural failures, confirmed revised policies, and emphasized that enforcement would be limited strictly to documented authority. There was no apology, but there was acknowledgement, and that was enough. As weeks passed, the story stopped being the tank and started being remember when. That transition mattered. It meant the lesson had been absorbed. The spectacle had done its job and could fade. I stood on the street one evening, watching headlights pass through an area that had once been blocked by 30 tons of steel. Everything flowed smoothly now. No bottlenecks, no tension, just movement. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had my car towed to show power. I followed the rules to show limits. And limits, once demonstrated publicly, tend to hold. By the time the season turned, the incident had stopped being a rumor and started being a reference point. People didn't retell it with exaggeration anymore. They mentioned it casually, the way you mention a landmark everyone recognizes. That was the moment things changed. When a power move becomes a lesson instead of a threat, it loses its ability to control. The HOA functioned differently now, and everyone could feel it. Meetings were shorter. Emails were precise. Language that once sounded authoritative was replaced with language that sounded careful. Every message referenced policy numbers, ordinances, or recorded covenants. Assumptions had been removed from the process. Residents noticed the shift immediately. People parked without anxiety. Guests visited without warnings taped to windshields. Contractors came and went without being interrogated. The street felt less like a monitored zone and more like a place people actually lived. That difference wasn't cosmetic. It was psychological. The woman who had ordered the tow kept to herself. When she appeared, she did so quietly, without eye contact, without commentary. There were no more neighborhood announcements, no informal enforcement, no attempts to educate anyone on rules. Her authority had vanished because the system no longer pretended it existed. That wasn't cruelty. That was consequence. The HOA board finalized its enforcement revisions and distributed them in writing. The document confirmed what everyone already knew. Towing authority was restricted, volunteers had no enforcement power, and any action affecting residents required documented jurisdiction and legal review. It was dull, procedural, and irreversible. Dull is good when it comes to governance. The tow company followed through as well. New intake procedures, ownership verification, written authorization requirements. They didn't want another incident tied to their name. Businesses remember exposure longer than people do. The police department's quiet adjustments continued to work in the background. HOA-related calls were flagged for verification. Officers arrived informed. Dispatchers asked better questions. That change didn't make headlines, but it prevented future misuse of authority more effectively than any public warning ever could. Neighbors began sharing their own stories, not out of anger, but out of relief. People realized they weren't alone in feeling pressured before. They realized compliance had been driven by confidence, not legality. Seeing that confidence collapse had been freeing. I didn't need to insert myself into those conversations. The story spoke for itself. The tank wasn't a threat anymore. It was a reminder. A visual proof that rules work both ways when someone actually follows them correctly. As I walked the street one evening, I noticed something simple but important. People waved. Not cautiously. Not curiously. Normally. The tension that had once shaped interactions was gone. That's when I knew the conflict was truly over. Not because she had backed down. Not because the HOA had revised policies. But because the neighborhood had learned how to recognize authority and how to question it. She towed my car thinking inconvenience would force obedience. What she did instead was teach an entire street how power really works. And once people learn that lesson, they don't unlearn it. When everything finally settled, the street felt lighter, unburdened by rules that had once been enforced through confidence instead of clarity. The drama was gone, replaced by routine. That's how you know a conflict has truly ended, when no one feels the need to revisit it. The HOA still existed, but it no longer dominated the neighborhood. Its role had been reduced to what it should have been from the start: maintenance, budgeting, coordination. Not control, not intimidation. People followed the rules that made sense because they were clearly written and fairly applied. The rest faded away quietly. The woman who had ordered the tow never confronted me again. She didn't need to. Her actions had already rewritten her position in the community. She moved through her days cautiously now, aware that authority required proof and that eyes were open. Borrowed power doesn't return once the system stops lending it. The tow company never contacted me again either. Their silence was confirmation enough that procedures had changed. The police department's adjustments continued to do their work invisibly, filtering out calls that once would have escalated without verification. One incident had corrected multiple systems at once. Neighbors stopped bringing it up after a while, not because it was forgotten, but because it had been understood. The lesson had taken root. People checked documents. They asked questions. They didn't assume compliance was mandatory just because someone sounded confident. I walked the street one last time before leaving for an extended trip, noticing how ordinary everything looked. Cars parked where they were allowed. Kids rode bikes without being stopped. Guests came and went without scrutiny. The road that had once been blocked by 30 tons of steel flowed freely again. The irony stayed with me. She had my car towed to demonstrate power. I followed the rules to demonstrate limits. Limits, once shown publicly, don't need to be enforced again. The tank was gone. The tow was reversed. The authority was corrected. And the neighborhood was better for it. That's how real justice works. Not loud, not vengeful, but permanent.